Each day we welcome the return of light. And we welcome this turning that has come as we have come through winter solstice and we now move into days where daylight grows a little longer. We come seeking the light that is in ancient stories, in contemporary wisdom, the light that is within the eyes of family and friends and strangers, the light that has been with us from before the human species could even be imagined. We connect with that long cosmic light out of which all things come, remembering that we are born of light and yet ever seeking it. We pray with one another this day, sharing the words that we find before us. As we journey into a new year, we long to bless what was, let go of what might have been, and embrace the miracle of what is. Amid harsh news and urgent cries, may we be attentive to the grace of what we can set free and what we must hold closely. May we cultivate a sense of humor that adds perspective to compassion, gratitude that adds persistence to courage, quietness of spirit that adds irrepressibility to hope, and openness of mind that adds surprise to joy. May it be so. This is our time for all ages, whether you're big or small, whether you're tall or short, whether you're young or old or somewhere in between. Come and join us on the carpet or join us where you are, and there'll be some pictures to see on the screen on the walls behind me. Welcome. I want to share a story with you this morning that's called The Walking Stick. And it's by a woman named Maxine Trottier, and she's from Quebec in Canada. And the pictures are by a woman whose name is Anuksha Galuchuka. It probably sounds nothing like that, but it looks a bit like that. You'll see the pictures up on the wall. When Van was a boy, see him there in the middle, he was wandering the forests of Vietnam where he lived, and he found a stick, that stick that's in his hands. It had fallen from a great teak tree, and the tree had grown near a Buddhist temple. For hundreds of years, that tree had been growing there. In the monsoon rains, a branch or two might break off the tree. But the tree stood strong and silent, weathering all the changes that had swept across that country. Van took the stick into the temple where the monks lived. With their shaved heads made shiny by the damp heat and their soft robes wrapped around them, the monks prayed and they chanted. And one of those monks was Van's uncle, the guy we see in the picture. He's not like other boys, his uncle often thought of Van. He must always see what is beyond the next hill. Together, they cleaned and polished the stick. Van's uncle found a brass cover to put on its tip. And when they finished, the walking stick glowed with the quiet life of the teak forests in Vietnam. "You found the stick near the temple under the shadow of the Buddha," said Van's uncle. "The Buddha will watch over you no matter where you go and bring you safely home." Van treasured that walking stick, and he used it every day as he went from his home to the rice fields and to the market. And every night he polished the stick until the teak and the brass just shone. The years went by, and Van got married, and in time he and his wife Mai had a daughter, and they named her Lan. When the festivals came, the family would go to the temple. The little girl loved the smell of the incense and the echoing drone of the monks chanting. Van's uncle still lived there. Now he was a very old man, very small and very wrinkled. "Ah, Van," he would say, his face lit with a toothless smile, "I see you still have the walking stick." From monsoons to harvest, it was a good life, rich with rice and wind in the palms, but the winds can blow in many things. And when war came too close, and Van heard the roar of the jets in the night, he picked up the walking stick. He sat on his heels thinking until the sun came up. "We will walk," he said to his family. And that's what they did. At first they had a cart that their water buffalo pulled. Then when they had to, they went on without it, carrying their few possessions. They crept through the forest full of nervous birds and small, bright-eyed monkeys. Van held the walking stick tightly, and he led his family from Vietnam, and they came to the sea. There, Van spent almost all of his money for passage on a ship to cross the ocean. Gray waves rolled and carried the rusty vessel to the east, away from the sound of the temple chants and the bustling markets of Vietnam. Van would stand at the ship's rail, the stick in his hand, and at night, while Mai and Lan were asleep, he would walk the deck under the cold, unseeing stars, and he would weep. The new country they came to was not an easy place. Almost no one spoke Vietnamese. The streets were filled with cars instead of bicycles. Still, the war had been left behind, and the years passed in peace. One day, a young man came to Van's house to call on his daughter. He had yellow hair and freckles, but his blue eyes were full of love when he looked at Lan. They married, and later they had a baby, and they named her Lynn. Every afternoon, Van walked with his granddaughter down the streets of their neighborhood. The brass tip of that stick kept tapping against the sidewalk. And Van told the stories of the land that he had left. He talked about his uncle and the temple and the cool mossy walls and the calm Buddha. Deep inside Lynn, those stories took hold like tiny vines. Their tendrils wound around her heart as the walking stick tapped, tapped, tapped. Then Lynn was grown, and Van was a very old man. She had the startling blue eyes of her father and her mother's silky straight black hair. And within her were all the stories that she'd ever heard. "I'm going on a long walk, grandfather," she told Van one day. For a moment, the fragrance of incense drifted in the air, and he heard the soft chanting of the monks in his memories. "This does not surprise me," said Van. "You have always seemed like a child who had to see beyond the next hill." And he gave the walking stick to his granddaughter. That spring, when Lynn was finished school, she sailed across the ocean. Each night the sun set upon the country she called home, and each day it rose over that land her family had fled from so long ago. In time, the crossing ended, and the river waters welcomed her. It was morning when Lynn stepped onto the soil of Vietnam. She started out tapping the ground with the walking stick. Chickens and fat-bellied pigs stood outside the houses and watched as she passed. After a very long time, she came to a temple. Soft moss clung to the walls, and around the jungle sang. Nearby, there was a huge teak tree. Into the temple she went, the walking stick in her hand, its brass voice finally silent. There stood that Buddha, smiling, and at his feet she placed some flowers and some food, and in the peaceful memory, sweet incense drifted. Lynn slowly ran her hand along Van's walking stick. She said a prayer of thanks for the long journey and those who had made it. And then she placed the stick at the foot of the Buddha, and she turned around and she began her walk home. That was a very important stick, and it made a very long journey, didn't it? It went from one country across the ocean to another very strange country, like where we live. And it did its job, and then it got placed back where it came from. Sometimes when you go on a walk in the woods, I bet you pick up a stick, and it takes you along your way, and then sometimes you leave it in the forest because it's done its job, and it stayed with you and helped you over the rough patches. Today, we don't have Kids Spirit, or we don't have preschool. They'll be back next week. But today we have time at the activity table. If you want to find something there, or you want to stay with your family, you're welcome to do that. And we're going to sing a song about walking. One more step along the way we go.
Remembering Matthew's version of the birth story. Joseph was already engaged to a woman named Mary when he discovered that she was expecting a child. As he considered his options, a messenger came to Joseph in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife. She will give birth to a son, and you will name him Jesus. And he will deliver his people from their oppression." When Joseph awoke, he decided to proceed with his marriage plans. When they were married, Jesus was born in Bethlehem during the time when Herod was king. Sometime later, those who studied the stars came from the east. They asked at the palaces, "Where is this baby born to be king? For we have seen his star and have come to honor him." After consulting with advisors, King Herod sent them to Bethlehem. Along the way, they saw the star again, and it went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was staying. When they went into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. They knelt down and offered gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. After being warned in a dream of the coming dangers, the Magi returned home by a different way. After they left, Joseph had another dream. A messenger advised him to take the child and his mother and flee south from Judea to Egypt, and to remain there until further word. So Joseph traveled with his wife and the young child to escape the dangers of Herod, who was searching for that child. Sometime later, Joseph had another dream that told him it was safe now to return home. Joseph was afraid to go back to Judea, so he journeyed to Nazareth in the Galilee, In this ancient story passed down from the first century, may we find wisdom for our living.
This is a poem entitled Detour by an American poet, Ruth Feldman. Ruth had been a visual artist until the death of her husband, and then she began writing poetry and continued to write poetry into her 90s. I took a long time getting here, much of it wasted on wrong turns, back roads riddled by ruts. I had adventures I would never have known if I'd proceeded as the crow flies. Superhighways are so sure of where they're going, they arrive too soon. A straight line isn't always the shortest distance between two people. Sometimes I act as though I'm heading somewhere else while imperceptibly I narrow the gap between you and me. I'm not sure I'll ever know the right way, but I don't mind getting lost now and then. Maps don't know everything. In the words of this poet, for many of us, this holiday season is a time of traveling. And whether our journeys take us to be with friends and family, or whether we journey out of our northern winter for a few warmer days, or we travel through our memories of Christmases past, or we retrace the steps of our year reviewing the touchstones of this past 12 months, many of us have been traveling in some way or other over these holiday weeks. And the stories that give us this season are tales of travel. Whether it's Santa making his annual pilgrimage from the North Pole to every household, or it's the first century birth stories of a great teacher, the stories that shape this season are tales of travel, journeys, stories of life in motion. The storyteller Matthew gives us the tale of exotic foreigners with their unique baby gifts, and then comes along another ancient storyteller, Luke, introducing us to sleep-deprived new parents and smelly shepherds and singing angels. And these two varied casts of characters would seem to have nothing in common. But each of these very different birth stories are almost entirely populated with travelers. In the world of the story, the traveling begins even before the child is born. Luke takes Mary, traveling into the hill country of the Galilee to meet her cousin Elizabeth, who's also pregnant. That's the beginning of a pattern that makes pilgrims of all these characters. In the world of Luke's story, parents will travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Shepherds will travel from the hills into town. Parents will travel with their newborn into Jerusalem from Bethlehem before taking the road north again to Nazareth. And in Matthew's story, foreign star trekkers will travel from east to one of Herod's palaces and then journey on to Bethlehem, and they'll return home by a new and undescribed route. And then the young family will travel from Bethlehem to Egypt as refugees from a cruel regime of Herod, returning a few years later to travel from Egypt to Nazareth after the king has died. And maybe it's the pilgrim nature of these stories that lend themselves to our pageantry. Maybe we reenact them again and again to locate ourselves within our own journey. Our reenactment, whether it's by retelling this story year after year, or unpacking our manger scenes and setting out the figurines, or dressing ourselves in badly matched fabrics with tea towels on our heads, or donning old plush bathrobes and carrying empty boxes wrapped in silver or gold foil. We merge these two totally different narratives into one cohesive story that never quite happened that way, but is always happening this way. Sometimes we find ourselves in that trusting young mother, pondering the mysteries of life against all odds. Sometimes we find ourselves in a reluctant father, seeking the courage to relinquish his privilege and rise to the occasion. Sometimes we find ourselves in the disoriented strangers, second-guessing ourselves, losing our way until reverence finds us and sets us on a path we've never walked before. Sometimes we find ourselves among the messengers, being those who have the strength and the capacity to support and reassure others. Sometimes we are that hopeful voice breaking through the overcast skies of someone's heart, seeing possibilities where others cannot. Sometimes we're like those messengers, seeing the bigger picture, seeing beyond the moment like the angels, and singing our praise of life in the midst of all of its trouble and beauty. And sometimes we find ourselves in the shepherds. We're those who are scared to death of life, longing to overcome our fear and be apprehended by wonder. Sometimes we find ourselves opening to our curiosity and able to let our feet follow our hearts, where we can experience again the miracle of living. Or maybe this year we're the one in the manger. Maybe it's the miracle of life or coming back to life that's awakening in us. For surely we are somewhere in this story each year. Somewhere among that colorful cast of characters who create this season for us year after year and remind us that this story is not so much about the birth of a particular human being as it is about the journey of becoming human. The only characters in either of these stories who never walk a mile in their own sandals or in anyone else's are Herod and his cronies. The privileged few are the only ones in these stories who never leave the protected walls of home for the realities of the road. The king and his advisors are the static characters who are deeply threatened by movement. And they've lost touch with what it is to rely on the hospitality of strangers or to trust the wisdom of the universe or the compass of your own instinct, or what it means to flee to another country in hope of a better life for you or your children. These stationary characters are very well served by the status quo. Having neither known or forgotten what it is to be vulnerable, what it is to be displaced, what it is to be at the mercy of others. They're holed up in the palace library, imagining scenarios of threats, crafting policies to protect what they think belongs to them, while endangering innocent lives. But for the rest of the characters in this story, there's no loitering. They don't get to linger anywhere very long. Matthew's story takes 10 verses to get the travelers from Persia or Mesopotamia or wherever it was to the child and his mother. But only a single line is given to that stop in Bethlehem. They dump their gifts and then it's, here's your turban, what's your hurry? It's back on the road again. And then that's it. They disappear from the story, never to be heard from again. So why does Matthew lead with these guys? Why are they front page news in his story? What is it about them and their disappearing act that draws us into the story that Matthew is going to tell about a Jewish peasant boy who has so many hopes pinned on him? I wonder if it's because the Magi are the first to show us that none of us can freeze the frame and stay where we are. Even the baby doesn't get to linger in the manger in the world of this story. Soon the story has the parents fleeing south, seeking refuge in Egypt. One of the great truths of life is that we can never stay where we are. Both the best of moments and the worst of moments pass. And time gathers us up into its current, and we have to keep moving. So maybe the Magi turn up every year to teach us how to journey, how to resist the urge we have to find a warm place and just settle in for a long winter's nap. While they might not have much to offer us in terms of tips for shoppers, they have great expertise in the travel department. We return to this story to find ourselves again, to reorient to the road, and to find what it is we need to continue on the healing journey of becoming as truly human as the ancient teacher, whoever and however he was born, lived a lifetime of being born. He lived a lifetime of being awakened to the depths of a kind of humanness that put flesh on words like, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. Pray for those who seek to harm you. We come to the manger each year where we will not find a map, but we will find a walking stick to help us keep following our curiosity, to lean into our reverence, to pray with our feet on this very difficult terrain we find ourselves walking, to make the road together as we limp and as we walk and as we run. And that's okay. The poet is right. Maps don't know everything. I love that many nativity scenes give Joseph a walking stick, not a shepherd's crook, but a simple walking stick. Something that isn't needed in a stable, but it sure as hell is useful for the road that's going to come. We pay attention to forecasts and travel advisories. And this story contains an important one. It's not an advisory about the hazards of the highway. It's an advisory about the dangers of not traveling. So we circle this ancient story again to remind ourselves to be sure to leave the palace, to be certain to leave that transcendent moment at the manger, to trust the road, to welcome newness, to pack a bag full of courage, to embrace change, to accept gifts from strangers, to make no advance reservations that would get in the way of receiving the hospitality of being an unexpected guest, and to remember, we won't get to retrace our steps. And like the journey of all wise ones, we will invariably need a new way home. The state of our world and the state of our planet tells us we can't keep doing the same things and expect to get a different result. In the world of this story, reverence is the beginning of going home by another way. A reverence that deepens our relationship with the stars and the sea, with the camels and the corn, with our friends and our enemies, with our beloveds and with the stranger. A reverence that causes us to pause and bow in deep humility and to rise and live a new and shining respect for the mystery of being and for the magnitude of life that calls this planet home. I want to invite us to take a few moments in the silence we share together to imagine how differently we might journey if the road before us was paved not with good intentions, but with genuine reverence. In a fresh new year, we gather at this spacious table, not to speak any magic words or invoke any supernatural powers, but to call ourselves into the collective energy of being a spiritual community that supports and encourages one another in persisting, in seeking justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly on this good and generous earth. And if we don't give up,
we share a bit of bread, knowing its journey from seed to grain, from field to mill, a journey of persistence in the midst of sun and rain to satisfy our hunger. Sharing bread, we remember if we don't give up,
transformation can happen. And we share grapes that are crushed into an unfamiliar form. From vine to vat, a journey of persistence in the midst of sun and rain to satisfy our thirst. Sharing the juice of these grapes, we remember, if we don't give up,
we find wisdom in stories ancient and new, in those who shared bread and hope with one another in the midst of their fears, those who found courage to persist in a cruel and difficult time, who persisted with love, even in the face of indifference and hate. Seeking wisdom in many places, we remember if we don't give up,
transformation can happen. So we invite you to this table, not because of what you believe or don't believe, not because you're a member of this spiritual community or any spiritual community, but we invite you because you are welcome to share in a ritual, to strengthen our resolve not to be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief, but to persist in doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly together.
This bread that we share might represent for us the bread of persistence, and this cup might represent for us and remind us that we are not alone. We share the cup of community.
And we remember if we don't give up. We invite you to use this time in whatever way is helpful for you. You are all welcome at this table. You are all welcome to hold your space in this circle. If you choose to come to the table, you'll find that it may be easiest if you come via the aisle that is to the left of the chair you're sitting in and return via the aisle that's to the right of the chair you're sitting in. And if you are helped by a gluten-free environment, you'll find Charles, our server, in the center of the table will have the elements that will be most helpful to you. When you're ready, come and share in the bread of persistence and the cup of community. we go in the gift of generous light, that which makes life possible. We go in the strength of who we are together, to persist in courage and strength, to bring about what is most needed, a transformation from cruelty to compassion, from hate to love, from unkindness to deep kindness. We go in peace and love and hope.